President Trump managed to get more than 200 Venezuelan gangsters flown out of the country to jail in El Salvador. And the people who care about the common man are upset about this. I need your help, gentlemen, Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, to think my way through this, because the arguments you're hearing from the left and in newspapers and from politicians are that we owed something to Tren de Aragua, whatever the name of the gang was, and these gangsters, we owe them something, and I don't know that we do. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. You know me, guys. I'm like Mr. I love the Constitution. I want us to adhere more closely to it. And yet, when I'm reading in various news sources today that people are upset because these people who came into our country illegally and now have been sent out of our country to El Salvador, to at least a temporary holding facility there until their cases can be dealt with, I'm sure, in negotiations between the U.S., El Salvador, and Venezuela, that we owed them a fair trial and a hearing here in the United States. Bill Whittle, it's tough because our legal system, if anything, bends over backwards to defend the rights of the accused because we would rather occasionally put what's the old saying? Like you
let a guilty man go free
yes.
than rather put an innocent man in jail.
Yeah. Yes. And so we really bend over backwards for this. But Bill, it's not that I want to have sympathy for these guys or even empathy for them. I want us to do what's right. What is your perception? Do these people who came into the country illegally and who we think are gang members and potential terrorists, do we owe them a U.S. soil hearing on their cases so they have a chance to say, no, I'm not part of that?
Are they U.S. citizens?
They are not.
Then the answer is no. Look, U.S. citizenship is so highly prized because it provides you with legal protections against external forces. That is the great American experiment. That is why we're not a democracy. That's why we're a republic. That's why we could, if we enforced the law, we could give up the democratic part as long as we kept the republic. There's really nothing that democracy could do other than weaken the protections of the individual that's provided to us in the Constitution. Now, the argument is that everyone should be entitled to to this level is a better way of putting it, to this level of protection of human dignity and sovereignty and the sovereignty of the person. The argument that liberals will make is that everyone should be entitled to these rights. But these rights are not a one-way street. Concomitant with the rights that we have as American citizens are obligations and responsibilities that we have as American citizens. And chief among them are to obey the laws of this country. These people broke the laws of this country by coming here. They are not entitled to the same rights as U.S. citizens are. And the thing about it that you can say, well, gee, that's not fair. But this is where the entire liberal progressive argument about illegal immigration falls apart. There is a pathway for an individual from El Salvador to have constitutional legal protections, and that is to apply to enter the country legally, apply for your green card, and then eventually go on and become a U.S. citizen. And I know this story rather well because I married a person who was not born in this country. I married a Russian citizen who first came here. We had to first of all, we had to pay a significant amount of money to lawyers. It was not an unattainable amount of money, I might point out, but it was necessary. We filed for a temporary green card. After we had been together for 6 months, we went back and had a bureaucrat decide whether or not I got to stay married to my wife, or at least stay married to my wife in my home country. He said, yes, I've decided to approve your green card. Now, the green card entitled Natasha to live in this country indefinitely. She's required to pay taxes and so on. And she has many of the rights that an American citizen has, but she doesn't have all of them. And she could have stopped there if she'd wanted to, but she didn't want to, and I certainly didn't want her to. So she went through the additional 2 years' worth of process of studying for that test. The citizenship test is 100 questions. They pull 10, and she wanted to get 100 out of 100. And that's what she studied for, and that's what she got. She got 10 out of her 10 anyway. All this to say that my wife now is an American citizen. She has the same legal rights that I do. She is as American as any other American. You could make a case that she's more American than many because she understands how the government works better than many people who could never pass a citizenship test, even though they're American-born citizens. But she went through the process in order to have earned those rights. And these people not only came here illegally, when they say they're gang members, these are not Christian missionaries working in the United States of America who are benefiting our society, and you could at least make that argument. So no, I don't feel any sympathy for them. And when people say, well, they've been here for 10 years or 20 years or whatever the case may be, then that's just simply that's the same thing as saying, look, I don't want to equate the two, but as an analogy, that is the same thing as saying a man murders his family, starts another life someplace. 20 years later, we find out that this is the guy who committed this heinous crime. Well, that's just 20 years you've been successfully running from the law. You knew you were breaking the law when you came here, and for you to expect to come into this country, break the law by coming in here illegally, and then continue to break the law as a gang member, and then feel that we owe you something is a bit of a reach, in my opinion.
Stephen Green, President Trump and his legal team called upon a law that I think was from 1798 called something like the Alien Enemies Act. And I think
that is the law,
yeah,
indeed.
May
Yes.
have been and never been repealed. It's part of probably the Alien and Sedition Acts of that time. And the judge, there was, obviously the Democrat lawyers rushed to court and tried to stop this process. And the judge gave a verbal order from the bench saying, turn those planes around. But basically, the White House did not respect the judge's verbal order from the bench. And by the time a written order was issued, they said the plane was already in international territory, so basically the judge didn't have jurisdiction. And Stephen Miller came out on the White House driveway and gave a little talk to the media about why the Trump administration was in the right here. But it seems, Steve, that some people think that the way you get due process of law, something you're not entitled to in most of their home countries, if you go to Venezuela, you probably don't get this kind of treatment. Ooh. The way you get it in the United States is by getting caught by a law enforcement officer. That is your qualification for due process. Does that seem reasonable? I'm not being facetious here. I seriously struggle with this because as an American, I want everybody to have due process.
It is an absurd situation. But I want to talk a little about the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 because I looked into this earlier today because it's something I thought I was going to have time to write this morning that I didn't because, this is way more fun than writing. Writing is work. And in time of war declared by Congress, or if the president declares that there is some kind of enemy invasion, the president is then granted broad powers to remove enemy aliens, which would include anyone who is here illegally. Illegal aliens is legally the correct term to use for aliens, people who aren't from here, who enter the country illegally. And the president is using those broad powers. And what cracks me up is all the people who look at our long history of welcoming immigrants. We've gone up and down over the decades and the centuries, sure, but broadly speaking, we're a nation of immigrants, and we welcome immigrants who come here legally. So you've got people on the left who are making this big excuse. Oh, it's un-American to do this. Well, the Alien Enemies Act was passed by one of the first Congresses and signed by President John Adams. These are the people who invented America. They know what the hell it is to be American. So let's just dispense with that bit of lefty excuse mongerings. That's exactly what it is. And understand that President Trump is acting within the broad powers granted to him by this 227-year-old law. I think I did the math right. I'm doing it in my head, while speaking. So I could be off by a century or a millennia or two. I don't actually know. So he's acting within his authority. You've got this Obama judge who basically thinks he's God and can order an airplane in international airspace to turn around. It is ridiculous on the face of it. The Supreme Court needs to slap this stuff down, but you can count on Chief Justice John Roberts. It's John Roberts, right?
Yep.
Yeah, to do the exact wrong thing. So Trump did his usual thing and said something off the cuff about we need to impeach this Obama judge that tried to turn the airplane around, which, by the way, the president has no authority to initiate an impeachment against a judge. So this is just the president spouting off. Roberts today, and we're taping this on Tuesday, gets all in a huff, not over the just one of many Obama judges and Biden judges far exceeding their authority. In fact, they're being referred to as wildcat judges here, or wildcat decisions. Roberts says, oh, shame on Trump for talking about impeaching a judge. He's impugning the dignity of the court.
Look who's talking.
Yeah, exactly. That's all I have to say about it.
Well, when I heard this story, and I'm being legitimate, I know sometimes I have a sarcastic tone in my voice that indicates that I'm just trying to be humorous. I'm not really, because there is something I think, in the soul of every American that says we want to treat people with equal justice under law. On the other hand, if you come into our country through the back door that happened to be unlocked, or if you break a window to get in, if you come into this country in an illegal manner and are a member of a dangerous criminal gang, and in some cases commit crimes while you're in these United States, I don't see at what point you gain the privileges of U.S. citizenship without following the pathway of U.S. citizenship. And there are two reactions, I think, that we're not going to hear about very much, but I think that are legitimate. The people most grateful to see 238 some Venezuelan gangsters flown out of the country to jail somewhere in Latin America are going to be the formerly Latin American people who lived in the neighborhoods where those gangsters were operating in the United States, some of whom may be former Venezuelan citizens or El Salvadoran citizens or Mexican citizens, and they will be glad to see the gangsters go. And then there's another group of people who will have a reaction that we won't hear much about, and that is gangsters thinking about coming to the United States. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.